So hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Advancing Systemic Change for a Sustainable Environment, which is being sponsored by Green Latinos. First, a bit of housekeeping. Please keep your microphone muted during the presentation and use a chat box for questions. Also, please address your questions for all to see, and we'll do our best to answer them at the conclusion of the presentation. We will be recording this presentation and posting it on PPAN's YouTube channel. My name is Rella Abernathy, and I work for the City of Boulder on many of the same issues as PPAN and Beyond Pesticides. In fact, I'm fortunate to serve on the boards of both organizations. PPAN is an advocacy and education organization working across Colorado to improve policies that promote sustainable land management practices, safeguard public health, and preserve biodiversity to make our state a safe haven for all who live here, from pollinators to people. And Beyond Pesticides was founded 40 years ago to address inequity that harms our farm workers, including dangerous exposure to biocides and unsafe working conditions. Over the years, Beyond Pesticides has continued this work. And since our food system and our other land management practices are all connected to human well-being and the environment, Beyond Pesticides works with communities and other organizations to develop scientifically based solutions for the broken systems that are threatening the future of our planet. So a big thank you to Green Latinos for sponsoring today's webinar, and I'd like to introduce Ian Tafoya.
Hello, and thank you to everyone again for joining us. My name is Ian Thomas Tafoya, and I am the Colorado State Director for Green Latinos, a national network of conservation and environmental justice advocates from across the nation. Green Latinos has been here in Colorado for the last 3 years, and I started as a part-time organizer, and I've now made my way to being a state director, and we're bringing on employees. Why? Because Colorado is poised to make a difference, and I hope that you leave today with ideas about policy changes that you would like to see in the world. I had a prepared statement here, but as I'm looking at these logos, I just love how we all have animals in our logos. I think we recognize the importance of animals and the importance of nature. It's instilled in the values of Green Latino members, and I believe the members of these other orgs and the people here today. Pesticides harm so many different things. They harm our water quality, the animals, and people. This year, Green Latinos and many organizations were part of a push for agricultural worker rights, fights that I thought my family had finished nearly 50 years ago, but alas, they're not. This is a continual fight against corporations, against greed, to do the right thing to protect our environment and to protect people. When I first saw this opportunity to come here with Jay, I thought, wow, this is a great opportunity. I hope that this can reach more people and more Green Latinos members in particular. My grandmother died of lung cancer. My grandmother worked in the fields and was a migrant farm worker vice principal. My grandma never smoked a day in her life, and she felt 100% fact that her death and her cancer were connected to pesticides. In my life, I've dedicated to organic food, to food justice, and as a result, I found my way into environmental justice, fighting against air toxics and pesticides, among so many other things. And we hope that you enjoy this conversation today. And again, as you're watching it, I want you to be thinking, how can we build power and what can we do to change these outcomes? Because my dream in the future is that our food and our water and our air isn't harming us, and that we can truly self-actualize. Thank you.
So it's my pleasure to introduce my friend Jay Feldman, the co-founder and executive director of Beyond Pesticides, a national organization based in Washington, D.C. Jay has dedicated a lifetime to build an organization and a movement to protect all of us and the environment from the impacts of pesticides and chemically reliant practices. Beyond Pesticides not only helps create change at the local level, but has impacted national pesticide policy. Thanks, Jay, for speaking with us today, and please take it away.
I showed Jay muted. Well, welcome again. I'll start by saying really appreciate being here and being part of this effort with Green Latinos and People and Pollinators Action Network. These kinds of conversations are really critical if we're going to make the changes that we really view as critical changes, essential changes, life-sustaining changes that are required over the next, 5 to 10 years. We, Beyond Pesticides, as Rella said, and thank you for that warm introduction, really appreciate it, Rella. Back at you, Rella has been a leader in this whole area and brings science to this process, which is incredibly important. We believe strongly that science must drive the decision-making that we're engaged in, we'll be talking about today. We recognize that people come at this question of pesticides from different entry points, whether we're concerned about kids, we're concerned about the environment, we're concerned about workers, we're concerned about access to safe food, water, drinking water, navigable waters, recreational waters. There are so many different entry points here, but I think what really unites this kind of conversation we're having is the question of public health impacts and how our public health relates to ecological health. And that's why I tend to start with this overview that, yes, we're concerned and we need to think about how we put together collaborative strategy, whether we're working in a nonprofit organization for a city, if we're working in a school district, if we're a landscaper, if we're an exterminator or a pest control professional, if we're a farmer, we all are united around wanting, I think, to create a safe environment, a safe and sustainable place to live. So the question is, how do we incorporate and utilize to the best extent possible science, policy, and then use that information for action? We can't just sit around and study the problem. We can't just sit around and craft policies that are incremental. We don't have time. I don't believe we have time for incremental policies at this point. That's why this talk today really is about systemic change. And what does that mean as we craft, our thinking going forward from all these different vantage points, depending on our view, our experience, our expertise, et cetera. I always start with Rachel Carson because for me, she has guided the thinking that has driven our work. I mean, we came on the scene in the late 70s, just as she was leaving and had left the scene really almost a decade before that. But her words are her legacy, right? And she really did open up this worldview, this understanding that we are part of a complex biological ecosystem. We forget that sometimes. If you read Michael Pollan's book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, he talks about reductionist thinking and how we have come up with these technological solutions to problems by extracting elements from the environment, let's say nutrients in fertilizer, NPK, nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus. And we've extracted those and then fed those to plants rather than trying to figure out how plants interrelate with nature. Well, Rachel Carson basically said, that's really a mistake. We need to understand the complex biological systems in which plants derive nutrients. And that's what we're really talking about, because in understanding those complex biological interactions, we then start to understand how we relate to that complexity. We as human beings, we, in the People and Pollinators Action Network, with a focus on pollinators and the connection to people, there's a direct understanding there, implicit and explicit, that we must understand the ecosystem in which these organisms, including ourselves, are operating. So when we throw these chemicals against living communities, one of the things I've learned over the last 4 decades is that we really don't understand as much as we should. and maybe as much as we can about the impact of doing that, of throwing these chemicals against these complex biological communities. So Rachel Carson opened the door to that conversation. I think her words, eerily, are still incredibly relevant. So I urge everybody to go back and read the book. She actually talks about organophosphates in the book. We always relate this book to DDT, and the organochlorine chemicals, which were really the first generation coming out of World War II that became household chemicals: chlordane, DDT, aldrin, dieldrin, heptachlor. These were the chemicals we used in our gardens, in our homes for termite control, used in agriculture. And we came to find out that they were deleterious, had adverse impacts on health and the environment. Eggshell thinning from cancer. Eggshell thinning, of course, in eagle nests and eagles, to cancer in human population. So we think about the book in that context, but she warned us at that time that there was another family of chemicals coming along, and that was organophosphates. And what did we hear a couple of weeks ago? That EPA is proposing to, or EPA is banning food uses of chlorpyrifos, and organophosphate, one of the most widely used, probably the most widely used organophosphate. I mean, think about that. This book was written in the 60s, and here we are in 2021. We were warned in the 60s that this was a problem. Now, part of what I want to talk about today is how do we get out from under this treadmill of moving through these generations of chemicals. And the concept here that, again, attributable to Rachel Carson, is that not only do we talk about the problem, but we must make wider use of alternative methods. She said that in the 60s. She said that way before we had organic, IPM, regenerative, sustainable, before all those terms. And really what she was imploring us to do is to consider alternative methods in her very calm way, scientific way. I'm a little less scientific in my approach and communication. But here we are. We're talking about systemic change. So, what is systemic change? Systemic change means that we're talking about fundamental change that affects how the whole system functions. So when I talk about a whole system, we're talking about how we manage a pest in the context of the biology of that pest and the environment in which it operates. So structural change is another term. We hear about structural change. We hear these terms used in the context of societal change, growing out of 2 years ago, what we saw with the murder of George Floyd, an awareness that there are some underlying principles in our society that we really need to grapple with. And these go to questions of how we treat each other, racial justice, the interactions between humans, and so forth. So we hear the term systemic change, and we hear the term structural change. Something in the structure of the way we educate, house, employ, manage our economic system has an impact on the way our health, our environment. I'll leave you with this one other thought on this particular point. COVID-19. You think we're dealing with a pandemic. Let's solve the pandemic. Let's get a vaccine out there. Let's get preventive solutions, and we'll move society to a place where we can control the pandemic. But in the process of doing that, we learned a couple of really important things that I think has bearing on this conversation today. We learned about the idea that there are certain parts of the population that are at higher risk, right? We learned that essential workers are at higher risk, right? Because essential workers couldn't leave their jobs. They had to continue to work. Their exposures put them in a category where they suffered disproportionate risk from the general population, like myself, who could sit at home, work remotely, and do our work. We learned in that process that those essential workers were disproportionately people of color, not exclusively, but disproportionately. So we saw death rates higher in people of color communities. These are facts. Death rates higher in people of color communities. That we refer to that as disproportionate risk. We're seeing the same thing with pesticides, okay? We see this with the farm worker population. We see this among farmers. We see this among people who live in what we call fence line communities near production facilities. We see this in the children of workers who bring home contaminated clothing. We see disproportionate risk. And we talk about the need to correct this as environmental justice, the need to affect environmental justice. The other thing we learned about that is really critical to this conversation is we learned about comorbidities. That's a term I heard for months on the nightly news, comorbidities. What does that mean? Well, that's something we've been talking to EPA about for decades. That is that we're not all the same. We have different occupations. We have different exposures. We have different food consumption patterns. We have different genetics. We are suffering from different levels of vulnerability to exposure. A child is more at risk than an adult from the same exposure. It's a scientific reality that a child is taking in more air relative to their body weight. They're absorbing more chemical relative to their body weight through their skin. Their exposure pattern puts them in a category of vulnerability. Elderly, their immune system is depressed. They are in a higher level of vulnerability. People that are suffering an illness, a cancer survivor, someone going through chemotherapy. These are comorbidities. And these are issues that we have to think about when we're thinking systemically. Now, everything I've just said to you is not taken into account when we register pesticides. And if it is taken into account, it's not taken into account fully, which means right from the get-go, when I say when a pesticide is registered, that's the EPA registration process. So that's the context in which we as a society are now starting to think about how can we make these systemic changes? How can we think more broadly on these issues? So right now, what I take away from these last couple of years with COVID and then intersecting with environmental and public health issues, that science matters. We really got to do a much better job of tracking science, for God's sakes. I mean, this pandemic was not a surprise to the scientists that have studied. The World Health Organization has identified the next pandemic already. And they've identified that next pandemic as resistance to antibiotics. We've heard about MERS in hospitals. We're going to talk about how that relates to pesticides. We use antibiotics in food production, apple and pear, and most fruit production, and in some row crops. Regulations can be politicized. We see that every day. You know what's happening. We're not letting the science drive the regulations. We're politicizing the regulations. We're facing irreversible challenges around the climate crisis, biodiversity decline. It's been referred to as the insect apocalypse. We're losing the rate of loss is irretrievable at some point. So we're failing in that regard, despite the fact that we have an Endangered Species Act, which is one of the best laws on the books, but is not being utilized adequately. We have undue corporate influence over environmental policy. I'll just say it. I mean, there are companies that are not embracing the challenges of climate, biodiversity, public health, disproportionate risk, environmental justice. And as a result of their not embracing it, that means they hire lobbyists that work to what they view as their economic benefit, and that does not necessarily serve the population and the greater good. Now, there are incredibly good corporations out there. This is not to paint a broad brush that you're a corporation, you're bad. No way. There are corporations that have incorporated issues of public health, environmental justice, issues of sustainability, and so forth and so on. I will get to this at the end, believe it or not, of this talk. Given the rate I'm going through these slides, one would question whether that's feasible, but here we go. We start with local decision making. You know, we're having a local conversation here. We work in our communities. If we're in business, we relate to our customers. If we're in a city government, we relate to our constituents. If we're in elected officials, we get out and we talk to people. We, you know, as individuals in our day-to-day work and our day-to-day lives interrelate. So we as an organization Beyond Pesticides really believe strongly that we do make a difference. Our decisions, whether it's subject to our household decision, whether it's in our school district, whether it's in our county, city government, we do make a difference. And you know what? What I've seen over the last 4 decades is the work that happens locally moves up through the system and then eventually becomes a social norm, becomes embraced at higher levels of government. Sorry about this, I keep going the wrong way. Okay, so there's an intersection here that I've already mentioned between pollinator health, land management, public health. It's really ecosystem health, land management, public health. And I'm going to touch a little bit on pollinator stuff because this is the organization sponsoring this. But I want to, in this context, focus on that interrelationship, as I mentioned earlier, with land management practices. Because if you take the chemicals that have been the focus of the decline of pollinators, the neonicotinoid chemicals, we know they cause adverse effects. They end up in waterways. They adversely affect the aquatic food web, keystone species. This is documented by EPA itself, despite the fact that they ignore the mayfly nymph larva in at a keystone level in the aquatic food web. We have recognized through this one chemical and its persistence, its impact on soil biology, soil microbiota, and then ultimately gut microbiome. So here's the interrelationship. If I put a pesticide or an herbicide, pesticide as I'm using it today includes insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, rodenticides. If I take a pesticide like glyphosate, which is a weed killer, and I understand the science behind glyphosate, it is patented as an antibiotic, and I put that chemical in the soil, that antibiotic, and now we know glyphosate, Roundup, is ended up in virtually every food group. It's in most of our bodies at this point, which means it's in our gut microbiome. So we are imbalancing not only nature, but we're imbalancing the nature in our system, in our bodies. And this isn't like a one endpoint outcome where you can say X chemical causes cancer, X chemical is neurotoxic. This is affecting whole body systems, which EPA does a very poor job of evaluating. So I mentioned the climate crisis. I'm not going to run through all the documentation on this. This is a given at this point. The UN, has done a really good job among other, respected institutions of recognizing that, we have a problem that we have to address. Again, when we talk about this problem, we have to talk about it systemically. And we have to, I believe, talk about it in this holistic context. So it's not only that we are facing emissions and higher levels of greenhouse gases, it's also, the impact that has on the sustainability of the planet. It's a disruption of microbial communities. And on the flip side, which is part of the holistic model, is what are the lost opportunity costs that we have in our decision making? So here we're talking about preventing the kind of carbon capturing and carbon drawdown that we get from the microbial community in the soil. So when EPA makes a decision and it says, we don't want to use this chemical because it's a carcinogen, and leaves it at that, it's missing an opportunity to look holistically at what the full ramifications of that chemical use are beyond the carcinogenicity to the whole system. And when we talk about whole system, we're talking about our whole body, we're talking about the whole ecosystem. So the other thing that really runs, hand in hand with climate, obviously, is biodiversity. And we know, we've heard this over and over again, of course, is that we can't really live without pollinators. Not only cannot certain crops can't exist, and we're already suffering from that by the fact that we have to ship pollinators across the country because we no longer can rely on natural or native pollinators. So we ship at industrial scale, pollinators across the country, back and forth, north and south, east and west. And that's because we have allowed decline in biodiversity. And again, international agencies have recognized that this is threatening the ability to meet basic needs. It's not just that a couple bees are going to die or millions of bees are going to die. We are not going to get our needs met. One of the things that is often overlooked with the pollination, just to give an example of the complexity, is that some people will say, oh, that crop doesn't require pollination. What we have found, what the science shows, is that it affects productivity. So even though a crop may not require pollination, having those pollinators in the field on crops that don't require pollination increase productivity. So you will see declines in productivity as well. Now, here's an interesting thing, and this goes directly out of the George Floyd, I don't want to even call it problem, but issue and tragedy. When the President Biden came into office, he signed a presidential executive memorandum, which really captures this moment in history where we are. And it's called Modernizing Regulatory Review. And what it does, it directs the heads of all executive agencies to produce recommendations for improving and modernizing regulatory review by promoting public health and safety, economic growth, which is always a part of it, I just didn't highlight that, social welfare, racial justice, environmental stewardship, human dignity, equity, and interests of future generations. This is supposed to be the priority of our country. This is an executive order to everybody that manages a federal agency. These must be translated into action. We can hold our government accountable to these principles. These are values, these are principles, they need to be incorporated into everything we do. And what's important about this is not only the federal agencies that are affected, but that this is a directive to the Office of Management and Budget. And for those who aren't familiar with the Office of Management and Budget, which sits in the White House, this is an agency that can nix a federal regulation because it finds that there's economic dislocation associated with that regulation. And it's been done, and it is done. It's even done in laws that require agencies to meet standards of safety that are embedded in that statute, because there's a determination that it will cause economic dislocation to the status quo, not to new emerging industries, new emerging greener industries, but to existing industries that would be seen as adversely affected by that regulation. So this sets a tone, this sets a framework, and that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about systemic change. What framework are we applying to our thinking, to our regulations, to our policy? And how do we employ that framework in a way that is workable? Now, for those who aren't familiar with pesticides, I just want to step back. I apologize to those for which this is a common knowledge, but pesticides are really pretty complex things. We refer to pesticides as that Roundup, that thing in the bottle, right? But that bottle really is a mixture of a lot of different things. There's the so-called active ingredient. That's the actual part of the formulation, the liquid, the granule, the dust that's in that can or in that bottle or in that bag, that percentage that kills that target pest, according to the manufacturer, is usually less than 1% of the product formulation. The rest of it is carriers, surfactants, synergists, things that help the product do what it does, but EPA doesn't really focus on that. So think about it. You're buying a product, your school superintendent is authorizing the purchase of a chemical sprayed in school, in classrooms and playing fields, farmers using products. They look at the label, active ingredient, 0.1%, 1%, let's say it's 40%. The rest of it is inert ingredients. These are non-disclosed ingredients, secret business information, proprietary information not disclosed on the product label. I can't even tell you, as a user of this chemical in your child's classroom, on your food, what I applied, because I don't know. It's not disclosed. It's inert. Now, it's not inert like we think of inert in the parlance, the common parlance, right? It's not innocuous. It's not no effect. It's inert because it's not active. It's inert because it is not purposely put into that product to attack the target pest. That's not why I put it in the product. It has nothing to do with the targeting the pest. You know what? Some of those inerts are active ingredients in other products. Some of them are on the Superfund list. Okay, so we have a problem with inert ingredients. Where we also have a problem with contaminants and impurities. DDT can show up as a contaminant. The one we see most of as contaminants are dioxin contaminants, furans, common benzene. These are toxic materials. They're not disclosed. We don't know that. I as a good faith professional applying a product, cannot tell you the degradation products, the metabolites, the breakdown products of the product I'm applying in your home, because I'm applying a product that EPA told me is registered and meets acceptable safety standards. So we're working through all of this, and I'm trying to maintain my calmness because I get a little excited about this stuff. And we're applying these things widely in the environment, right? And we know that 17 of the 30, we're updating this, it's actually 40 now, and we're going to be putting out a new analysis shortly here. 17 of groundwater contaminants, 18 toxic to birds and fish, 26 toxic to aquatic life, 12 toxic to bees. So we have these, I'm going to call them for the moment indirect effects, because certainly we're not putting these pesticides out there to adversely affect these organisms. But we recognize that we are having this effect, and it's even more complex than this. Look at the impact of glyphosate on habitat. So we're applying it to the field. We're applying it in the context of, say, agriculture, best example, and it's adversely affecting the habitat of these organisms because we're killing milkweed, we're killing the plant they need to survive. We're seeing these kinds of deformities and chronic adverse effects. So we put together this database because what we found was, because of this disconnect, people weren't really connecting to the diseases they are experiencing, cancer, Alzheimer's, learning disabilities, asthma, diabetes, reproductive effects, with their day-to-day interactions with the environment exposure. It's just not happening. So it became clear to us that there's a whole bunch of science out there that is connecting these dots. EPA doesn't even look at this literature. They don't look at the fact that they take these laboratory studies, they evaluate the studies and extrapolate to the environment and human population. We are looking at what are the studies, most of these are epidemiologic studies. What are they finding out there? What are they seeing in death rates associated with herbicide use in farmers? What are they seeing in childhood cancers? We just, I think it's today, we published a story on leukemia in children. What are we seeing in the population? Why isn't EPA looking at this stuff? This database is intended to answer that question. I put this up there just because glyphosate is so widely used, even though Bayer's announced that it's removing residential uses, still widely used in all genetically engineered crops, essentially, that are herbicide resistant, herbicide tolerant. And yet EPA looks at glyphosate, but it doesn't look at the breakdown product, which is as toxic, if not more toxic, AMPA, as the active ingredient. So here's where I'm coming from on all of this. And I said this a little earlier, but I want to reinforce the point. When I have the benefit of having been through 4 decades of this work, right? And when I jumped into this, I thought, I'm going to go after these chemicals, these badass chemicals. They need to go, because obviously the science is clear. Now, as I came into this, DDT was still there around, but we were phasing out the minor uses. Arsenicals, still, we use some arsenic. In lead arsenate was still being used in grapefruit production when I came on the scene. Got rid of that. Chlordane, widely used in everybody's home for termite. Our phone was ringing off the hook with people who were really worried that their home was contaminated with chlordane because there were little cracks in their foundation, which is common in any foundation. And EPA didn't take into account the fact that a home treated inside the home with chlordane could volatilize into the indoor ambient air and contaminate it, I believe, still contaminates millions of homes across the United States. These are organochlorines, et cetera. So we began this process of working through these chemicals one by one. We sued, we campaigned on Capitol Hill, we went to state legislatures, because often state legislatures move quicker than the federal government. Chlordane, New York, DDT, Michigan and Wisconsin. You can go down the list. 2,4,5-T, Oregon. The states are often ahead on the individual chemicals of the federal government, and then the federal government follows. So don't ever think we need to wait for the federal government. We've seen it now on chlorpyrifos in Hawaii and New York and California and Maryland. There's this pattern of states going out in front. But we move to alternatives. You go in, you walk into EPA and say, I want alternatives. You know what they're thinking? What alternative chemical do you want us to register? And I'm saying, no. We want you to talk about alternative methods of pest prevention and alternative methods of pest protection that are not reliant on toxic inputs. But that's not where we are as a society. That's because we are not thinking systemically. We're thinking about what's going to replace chlorpyrifos now. Well, it's going to probably be bifenthrin or some synthetic pyrethroid that's going to replace it, neurotoxic, endocrine disruptor. What have we accomplished with that change? So we call that whack-a-mole. This emanates from this federal law that has this quirky name of Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, Rodenticide Act. Now, it's funny. Sometimes people refer to this law as a good law, and they try to mimic it in other laws and say, we need to improve our review of TSCA, Toxic Substances Review Act, Control Act, like FIFRA. And I go, what are you talking about? This law has so failed us. This law, first of all, it doesn't look at whether we need a chemical to achieve a pest management goal, whether we're talking about profitability or productivity. That's not even on the table. The marketplace determines that. Can you imagine a society in which we introduced a chemical that we know causes harm, we deem it acceptable, we recognize that vulnerable population groups that are disproportionately affected by these chemicals, we have huge areas of uncertainties that are acknowledged, uncertainties. We don't test for endocrine disruption. We recognize that we often don't have information on the vulnerabilities, particularly children, and we attach a margin of safety to that. Let's say we multiply the allowable level by, or we reduce it 10-fold. That's a 10-fold margin of safety. 10, in my mind, 10 times 0 is 0. If I reduce an endocrine disruptor 10-fold, I probably have had no effect, because the endocrine disruptor and its impacts are a function of critical windows of vulnerability during developmental phases of life. It has nothing to do with dose. Dose makes the poison, we hear over and over and over. But EPA does not, knowing this, and knowing we don't have a system for evaluating for endocrine disruption yet, after Congress mandated it in 1996, doesn't even consider whether we need that chemical to achieve food productivity and profitability. That blows my mind. So some would say, well, that would be a precautionary principle. Well, yeah, that would be a precautionary principle, but the standard of safety in FIFRA is protect man and the environment, humans and the environment against, the word is man, unfortunately, against unreasonable adverse effects, Is it reasonable, and I have beat my head against the wall on this with EPA for years, is it reasonable to expose people to a known toxin with all these deficiencies we've just discussed when we know we can achieve that goal without that chemical? Profitably, competitively, productively, effectively. I'm not going to get into all the other problems, except to leave you with this notion that there are complexities here that are just unfathomable. They're really unfathomable. You can start with mixtures, synergism. I mentioned inerts and metabolites. Endocrine disruption, I mentioned. Just think about compliance. Compliance. The law assumes 100% compliance. If I mix a chemical wrong, if I sprayed it in the wrong place, these are complexities that are not addressed in federal and state laws. So what do? I'm learning this, and my eyes are popping out of my head. I'm enduring what we in our office and our organization call FIFRA shock, because the more you learn, the more you ask yourself, literally, you'll read something and then you'll go back. That can't be true. Let me go back. It can't be that we have formulations of chemicals, the majority of which have not been evaluated for impacts, that there are mixtures in this bottle that have not been evaluated for their synergistic or mixed cumulative effects as mixtures. So you're forced to step back from that and say, well, how can we do this differently? How can we just ask the different question? How can we start asking the question? How can we ask our legislators, our decision makers, to ask a different question? And that starts with the ecosystem. And there's this book, Teeming with Microbes, Teeming with Soil, Teeming with, he has a series of books. It's just a beginning point that starts to understand this, and very simply written, this relationship that we have with nature and that we're dependent on. So I guess this is obvious. This is what I'm getting to. I took all of this experience with FIFRA myself, personally and professionally, and I said, how can we construct a law that looks at the world differently, that recognizes that we need to ask different questions? We're going to need some synthetic materials. We're going to need certain things, but how can we ask different questions? And we came up with the Organic Foods Production Act. Now, prior to this, we actually required EPA or USDA to set up a program of research under something called the Agricultural Productivity Act. And you should know that these laws, both these laws, the predecessor law to this and this, were passed in like 2 years. In 2 years. And by a bipartisan, now that's a hard thing to achieve these days, admittedly, but a bipartisan coalition, members of Congress could get behind these concepts. Okay, so we created the Organic Systems Plan. We looked for compatibility with ecology. We looked to protect and enhance biodiversity. And we said, we need a list. We need a list. We need to come up with materials that meet these standards. We need to default to no synthetics, but if we are to allow synthetics, we need to meet these standards. And central to that standard is essentiality. I sat on the National Organic Standards Board for 5 years under the Obama administration. I can't tell you how many times an industry group comes to us and says, we've come up with this great new synthetic weed killer, and we'd like to use this all in organic. and we go, well, can you answer this question? No. Can you answer that question? No. But you know most, yeah, we know most about what this happened with biodegradable mulch. Biodegradable mulch, plastic mulch. They didn't call it plastic, they call it biodegradable. It's plastic mulch. Yes, a portion of it biodegrades, but we don't know how much of it biodegrades given the soil conditions on different farms. So what does that mean? That means we don't know what the degradation products are and how and at what rate they will degrade. I voted against that, and we put a caveat in the statement, and USDA has still not been able to register that until they change the language of the board vote, because they don't know the damn breakdown products, and they don't know the timing of the breakdown, and they don't know the impact it will have on soil microbial activity. But if they change the underlying edict or the standard created by the board, they will be able to allow it. But the point is, we could say to that manufacturer, we could say to them, nice, good work, keep working at it. Maybe you'll get there, but you don't even meet the essentiality threshold, because we have other mulching systems. We have intercropping. We have, mulching, we have a crimper. We have ways of putting in like in this row here, let's see, the next field, where you put nitrogen fixing legumes within the rows, and you create this cycle that many of you are familiar with. And we call this cultural, biological, mechanical methods that we have to evaluate before you can allow a material on the national list of allowed and prohibited substances under 50. You know how many times a manufacturer has come to us, not under FIFRA, under the Organic Foods Production Act, and said to us, wait a minute, FDA allows this under their generally recognized as safe standard. Wait a minute, EPA has allowed this product to be used. Our response is, we don't evaluate under their standard. We have a systemic, holistic standard. We look at essentiality. We look at compatibility with ecological systems. None of these other laws you've referred to do any of that. We have a different regulatory evaluation standard. And so here we are, we're doing this. We're a $60 billion industry. Now our challenge is to protect these standards. Because one thing I have learned, as most activists have, if you're successful at achieving a goal under a statutory standard, there will be those groups out there that will be in there fighting to change that statutory standard. And that's what's happening now with organic. The fight is on. This has been successful, but the big food industry wants into this. They want a piece of the pie. And what's their goal? Their goal is to return the greatest profit to their shareholders. That's their number one goal. That's their reason for being. So to the extent that they can reduce costs associated with agricultural production, they are doing what they are employed to do. How do you reduce the cost of production? You make the Organic Foods Production Act less rigorous. You take away this connection to organic compatibility. You take away issues of essentiality. You take away these issues of compatibility with the ecosystem. So I beat this thing to death on the ecosystems. I've explained the systemic solution to build on with organic, and I'm not going to sit here and say organic is perfect. We put in, which doesn't exist in any other federal law, a sunset clause in the Organic Foods Production Act for that national list I mentioned. Why? Because we learned under FIFRA that once you get something registered, it's virtually impossible to get it off, because the whole industry evolves under it. So we put a sunset clause in there, and that sunset clause, I'm going to wind down in 5 minutes, okay? That sunset clause forces this chemical to be reviewed, this allowed synthetic substance to be reviewed to the same standard in which it was reviewed initially to get on the list. I put this slide in here to show this holistic nature. This is a great study, 2016, Washington State study. I'll get you, I should have the site on here. I have the site. But in all areas of our concern, when we think systemically and holistically, we are achieving results, and the cost will come down over time. But you know why the cost is higher in organic? You know why? because of the externalities that we see in conventional, the cleanup of water, the sewer systems that can't keep up with the antimicrobial pesticides that they can't get out because of infrastructure problems, the cost of cleanup, the cost of climate change, the cost of trucking pollinators across the country. Who bears the cost of that? We do, not the chemical company. And you can see on the right side here, the organic side, that these leaves on this chart, in virtually all cases, okay, yield, we're still catching up. In some cases, this is not true everywhere, and things have improved since, but the profitability is greater. Look at the profitability, greater than in conventional chemical intensive. And you go around biodiversity, minimization of water pollution, ecosystem services. I love this one. Reduce worker exposure. I mean, that's a no-brainer. Look at this. Reduce worker exposure versus reduce worker exposure. So it's a win-win, and the economics are on our side. So what do we do with this? We throw away these concepts that they're red herrings. They're Trojan horses. IPM is out. I'm sorry. I know there are a lot of very sincere people that believe in IPM. It played a role. I promoted it for a decade. It's out. Doesn't define allowable materials, doesn't create a connection to ecosystems. If you're a good IPM manager, you can IPM your way to organic systems. And I say to every good IPM person, show me an IPM system that's equivalent to organic, and I'll be in there with you all the way. The good thing about organic is there's an enforcement system around it. So you don't just make a claim, you have an organic systems plan and you have enforcement. And this explains a little bit about how the board actually, we took this same system from the Organic Foods Production Act and put it into this legislative proposal for pollinators to try to incorporate these concepts to be protection. It's a longer story. We could probably talk about this for the rest of the session. We're not sitting around waiting for EPA to embrace these systemic changes. We can't afford to think, where can we affect these changes at the highest level of government? We need to work there. Yes, we need to work there. We need to work in Denver. We need to work in DC. We need to work at the highest levels we can. But that should never preclude us working locally. The biggest change agent right now in our country for these challenges are your public works and parks directors in your local city and county parks. These are the biggest change agents. They hold the tools to showing the path forward. And it's really exciting because when they start learning about what we're talking about here and how we can cycle nutrients, how we can produce nitrogen naturally, how we can eliminate worker exposure, their workers, how we can protect their families and their communities, they are all in. They are all in. So how do we do that? We start with training. What's the soil about? What's the soil basics? But here's where these guys mostly have not been trained. No one's ever trained these guys. I don't care if you've gotten a PhD or where you are, you haven't been trained in microbial activity in the soil and the soil food web. That's changing now, and it's changing fast, because now soil scientists are recognizing that we can't just do what Michael Pollan warned us we shouldn't do and be reductionist and apply food to plants. We must feed the soil and feed the microbial life. And we can't do that with synthetic fertilizers. And the reason we can't do that for a number of reasons, but not only are we contaminating them with the high salt content, but we're not supporting their life. We're leaving them out there to die. Okay, so we recognize in this systemic change, which is recognized in the Organic Foods Production Act, it's not product-based. It's not product-based. It's systems-based. And now we're talking about soil systems. What do we do to build the soil system? And we refer to that as cultural practices. So we sit down with the local parks people and we talk about these things. How can we overseed more? What is our mowing height? How do we cultivate? What is our watering? And we're learning, by the way, that we can retain moisture, you probably know this, better in these soil systems than we do in chemical intensive systems. And then we try to codify these practices. So Montgomery County, Maryland adopted a law that basically said they have the authority in Maryland at the local level to adopt standards that are more protective than the state. So in this context, they can say to their residents, you know what, we've decided that you using pesticides on your property, you may like what that does for your look, whatever, the aesthetic, but it's harming our community. It's harming the greater good. So we're banning it. Now, right now, Colorado preempts local jurisdictions from doing that. So all the jurisdictions, the parks that are doing these things or talking about doing these things are talking about the changes on public land. But we want to see it grow beyond that. So we're working with communities like South Portland, Maine. State of Maine also believes in its local citizenry and believes in the power of democratic decision-making, where if they feel the state doesn't adequately protect their kids or their local waterways or their local environment, that they can adopt a standard that is more protective than their state standard. And this has been upheld. And in fact, the state helps us to help and works with the communities to advance these policies that are more protective. And what we're doing now is, because we're thinking more holistically and systemically, we're incorporating not only a pesticide ban, but a synthetic fertilizer ban. The last community to do this last week, signed by the mayor, was Maui County, Hawaii. And don't think because it's Hawaii and they care about the environment. Most of you may know that Hawaii is ground zero for corporate agriculture. Hawaii is run by plantation agriculture. Moving legislation like this in Hawaii was no easy feat. And what they have done, as Portland did, is they tied the allowable materials to the national list of allowed and prohibited substances. Now, some have said, well, those are food use. That's the Organic Foods Production Act. The parks director of Missoula, Montana, where we're working, when confronted with that challenge, said to us the other day, growing grass is just like growing food. To take in, and I know there are political realities on the ground. I think our job as scientists, as activists, as policymakers is at this point to promote a systemic solution to these problems. If we're going to ban individual pesticides like glyphosate, Bayer says they're taking it off the residential market, and the EPA, who knows what's going to happen with continued use of food. It probably remain for the next couple of decades, and then they'll acknowledge that it's a problem. We is to collaboratively, and we need to find corporate partners, and we are finding corporate partners to do this. We need to say there's a better way, and that if we're going to go after an individual chemical, we only go after it in the systemic and holistic context. That's key to our success, because we spend, I would say a couple of million, hundreds of millions, let me put it that way. Okay, tens of millions of dollars were spent by the public interest community, and probably tens of millions of dollars were spent by the corporate community in debating the end of chlorpyrifos. Do you think, in retrospect, when we get up against climate and biodiversity collapse, when we look back and look at our kids and say, we banned 5 organophosphates, we banned glyphosate, we banned DDT, do you think our kids are going to care? What did you do about putting a new food system in place? What did you do about changing all the parks in Colorado to organic land management? We have the power to do this. And once we get this critical mass of change across our states and in our communities, this, I can tell you, I've seen it, this percolates up, and this becomes the cultural change of our nation. So we're doing big things by thinking small and starting small and making these changes across the board. So I'm going to stop there, and I really appreciate it. I apologize for going over on the time.
Well, thanks, Jay. We have a few questions, and I'm going to ask you one that you should be able to answer pretty quickly first. So do inert ingredients within pesticides include surfactants?
Yes, they do.
Yeah, they can. And
They
then
can.
there are several questions.
You know, just on that, I'll say that sometimes manufacturers market the surfactant separately. So you can add the surfactant to the formulation, and then you know what you've added. But they are included in many pesticides, yes.
Yeah, and there's hardly anything on the toxicity of surfactants that I've seen, but they usually carry some pretty substantial toxicity. There are several questions about products, and I know that you, Jay, and those of us who do natural land management tend to avoid the whole product swap debate. But there's a question about 25B exempt products, whether they're worse or better than registered product, and if they go through ecological safety or efficacy testing. And there's another one about organic pesticides versus non-organic, and aren't some non-organic or some organic pretty harsh? And one more related in that vein is whether or not something is organic or synthetic. Can you tell anything about the toxicity of the chemical? So I think the three of those, work together as one question.
Yeah. Okay. This, for me, there are a lot of different ways to answer this question. I answer this question from the framework perspective. Is that chemical, whether it's 25B or national list under organic, is that chemical being evaluated in a framework that allows me and scientists to incorporate knowledge that can continually improve our restrictions? And I would say on the FIFRA side, on the glyphosate side, on the chlorpyrifos side, the answer is absolutely not. The system in place does not allow for us to respond to the leukemia study that is on our website today and the obesity study that's going to be on our website tomorrow morning. These are emerging scientific issues that cannot and do not, even the B issue, the question of impact on pollinators, doesn't fit into the FIFRA structure. So the way I take that question is, do we have a framework in place that can adequately regulate these materials in a time, first of all, that the baseline is as protective as we can be now, currently, and that we have in place a system that is nimble and responsive to the science in a reasonable amount of time so that we can move away from the chemical. And again, I have to emphasize that it takes into account essentiality. Because if you're asking me that question in the context of current land management practices, then you're not asking the right question, I mean, with all due respect. Because there may be something in the management system that could be changed that would eliminate the need for that use. So like you'll see in the Hawaii, the Maui ordinance, if you want to come in for a waiver, first of all, you have to show that the chemical is needed to protect public health. That's a pretty high bar. But you have to come in with a plan. You don't just come in and say, chemical, this is what, by the way, this is what the rice producers did with EPA for genetically engineered rice, because glyphosate was no longer working on, I forget, 10 million acres in Texas. They came in and said, our glyphosate isn't working, EPA. We would like to use propazine as an emergency use, right? So that's embedded in FIFRA. That's embedded in FIFRA, that if your pesticide's not working, EPA should be saying, well, can I see your management plan? Can I see how you tracked resistance and whether you made a determination that something's going wrong here because you've got a monoculture, you've got a genetically engineered crop that depends on the same herbicide use? Duh, you are going to have a resistance problem. So I think the good starting point here is the national list and 25B. And the reason we went with that, not because it's the perfect, I would rather every state government, every local government have a scientific panel and do their own evaluation of every chemical they use. Is that going to happen? I tried that in the early years. I tried to say, here's a list, but you should evaluate this because of blah, 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 blah. And I got blank stares. This is not feasible. We don't have the budget. I'm trying to do that balancing act between real systemic change and realities. And so we came up with this concept of pointing to existing lists and then making sure that we continually reevaluate those lists. And we call this continuous improvement. That's what organic. I sat on as I mentioned, the board, the NOSB. We removed in my tenure, you thought this would have never happened. It has never happened at EPA. We removed, believe it or not, and you can say this is how organic gets a bad name. They allowed antibiotics for fire blight in apple and pear production. That came up under sunset. Don't have that in FIFRA. That came up under organic law during my tenure. I was chair of the crops committee. I said, I don't want this chemical used anymore. Now, I didn't just sit there and say, what's the product swap? We called the European Union. We talked to farmers that didn't have fire blight. We investigated the alternatives. We had a technical review document prepared for us. We have in the budget at USDA, we have access to monies to hire people to answer these questions from a scientific perspective. These are questions again and again and again. I can't emphasize this enough that EPA is not asking. What is the impact on the ecology? What is the impact of rootstocks? What is the impact of trimming, different trimming techniques? What are you planting? What are you planting? What is your irrigation? What is your soil management plan? The EPA is not asking any of these questions. And we came to the conclusion that we needed to get rid of antibiotics in apple and pear. That was the only allowed use of streptomycin and octitetracycline. So do you see what I'm saying? It's a starting point that gives us the ability to constantly improve from where we are now. And it shuns this product replacement approach. And it embraces the ecology and a holistic whole systems thinking. And you know what? It's working. We can point to models where it's working. Now, let me address the question of the only things I can think of that people may be upset about is copper sulfate, which I don't like, some copper products, some sulfur products that are used in organic. And again, these are chemicals that come up every 5 years and that we can petition at any time to remove from the market. And this is where we need everybody's help. You can't just sit back and say that chemical on the list shouldn't be there and that's organic's no good. No, you don't think that chemical on the list should be there? Bring us the science, help us remove. So what we did with sulfur and copper, it's not just on it's not like in conventional. You have to test your soil. You have to put their soil management plan in your plan and be subject to review by inspectors and certifiers. You go above the allowed limit that we have on the allowable list, then you are disallowed from using it. So it's a complex system that gets granular. You can't just wipe it with a broad brush and say they allow copper in organic, because that's not the full story. We have limitations on how it's used. And if those limitations can be improved, we have a system that can improve it. And we have the power. The NOSB meets twice a year. I see very few environmental organizations, conservation organizations showing up at those meetings. We have an opportunity to testify twice a year. We have an opportunity to interact. Anyway, I won't beat that. But I will agree with anybody that criticizes any material that if we need to remove that. I will not defend any material that anybody can identify a problem with, and I will work. We're starting some petitions right now on certain materials that we will seek to remove from the allowed list. I can't do that on the organic side in a reasonable, I'm sorry, on the chemical side, on the FIFRA side, in any reasonable time frame. Maybe the next 4 decades, but doesn't exist.
So Jay, something that's more simple that people might be thinking about, and I've actually had this discussion with one of the Monsanto scientists,
Right.
is, one of the products that people use sometimes for weed control is horticultural vinegar. And it's, it can be incredibly damaging if you get it in your eye, and it can cause burns.
Yes.
And our staff doesn't use it for that reason.
Right.
And, and if you compare that to glyphosate, you're talking about 2 very different things, because, when you're talking about the safety of, I use that term lightly, of glyphosate, you're talking about acute toxicity. So, you can get glyphosate on your skin. You could probably even, ingest quite a bit of it, and you're not going to have an acute response like you are with vinegar. But, from vinegar, you're not going to get long-term health problems like cancer. So I think those are kind of false.
Burns.
Yeah, I think those are false
equivalents,
comparing those 2 products to each other.
No, in many cases, apples and oranges, but there are adverse effects. There's no question about it, and they need to be recognized.
That's right.
And, it's interesting. I've mentioned the whole organic systems plan. You can't, as an organic farmer, and I'm not saying that the oversight, the inspection system is perfect, but we don't even have an inspection system in conventional agriculture. We don't even have an inspection system. We don't even ask farmers to come up with a plan. So we do on the organic side. There are problems, you read about it. We can improve that system, and we fight to improve it every day. But you have to have an organic systems plan. And you know what? If vinegar is allowed, you can't just use vinegar. You have to have a soil management plan and a systems plan for that farm that explains how you're going to avoid inputs. Inputs are not the starting point. Inputs are the default in a chemical intensive agricultural systems. Not using inputs is a default in an organic system. So if I'm going to use some of these toxic, that vinegar is toxic. We warn people about that all the time. Horticultural vinegar, I should say. And so, we're going to talk to them about other ways of, now if we're talking about fence lines. So I was talking to a land manager, I forget, one of our cities yesterday. What do I do about fence lines around my fields? Well, we could have said vinegar, use vinegar. We didn't say use vinegar. We said there are weed mats. There are alternative plantings that can be done. There are alternative ways of thinking about the management of that fence line. And that's our job, to help construct that thought process and come at it. So yeah, chemical substitution is not the first question to ask. And it is the first question we get. We'll go into a community and they hear about what we do. And they say, oh, good, so glad you're here. Can you tell us what organic pesticides to use? And that's reasonable from their perspective, given the system they have. We've asked people to buy new equipment, and we understand that's a capital outlay. If you're going to compost tea, you might have to buy a tea brewer. If you're going to get a certain type of aerator so that you can aerate and then overseed, you might need a different type of piece of machinery that you don't have. So I'm not, my hope is that as we get more momentum and the connections to existential crises are really taken seriously, that these additional outlays that now seem to be barriers to these transitions in our communities will be overcome. Every town that we go into now has a climate action plan, or they're working on a climate action plan. The city, South Portland, most of our discussion on the fertilizer was not, we talked about hazards to the ecosystem and the organic system. We did talk about that extensively, but we also talked about whether the community, and this is a very future thinking community, whether they cared about buying fossil fuel materials. And what they are committed to taking the city off of fossil fuels. So here's low-hanging fruit. They can remove fossil fuel-based pesticides and synthetic pesticides, I'm sorry, fertilizers from the mix. And then they are meeting their community values. And so we need to blend and coalesce with these broader issues that communities are now grappling with from a values perspective. We haven't really treated pesticides from a values perspective. You know, what's our value? Yeah, we want to protect our kids. What's our value around protecting the future of the globe, you know? And what does that mean in terms of how we allocate resources in our community? And then all of a sudden you do see dollars being freed up because the community now sees the role that they play and the value that they play in solving these larger existential crises.
Okay, well, we're pretty much out of time, and I want to end with one of the hopeful questions. And Joyce, you know, hopefully you can help answer this too. Now if I can find it. It was the one about resources. So what local resources, actions, and organizations can we of Boulder Valley work through to encourage local change? Besides PPAN. So PPAN's a great organization.
Yeah, I'm really serious about coalescing with corporations. In my lifetime, I've seen the fastest change happening through the private sector. Organic wouldn't exist if there weren't a number of companies that stood up and said, we can do this. They brought themselves together, created a voluntary standard at the time. We codify, you know, in part codified that standard. So I put that out there because we've joined forces with natural grocers. And they are supporting local transitions. As you probably know, they operate in 20 states, 161 stores. And they obviously are in Colorado, and there are resources through us that we can make available to help at the local level to affect these transitions. But, you know, there's an organizing process around that, you know, and it involves community engagement and community involvement. And then we can bring in the technical resources to develop a plan to manage parks and public spaces organically. So that's an example of a partnership with a corporation. There are other corporations, they don't even have to be related to land management. They can be we've been talking to a mattress producer. They, you know, it is now, we're doing ethical buying, right? Everybody on this call probably does ethical buying. You have standards, you have belief systems, you are utilizing that with, you are essentially implementing those belief systems through your purchasing. And we want to know where our food comes from, how it's grown, what impact does it have on the ecosystem? Is it fossil fuel based? You know, and those, we can reach out to people in our communities that have resources that should be supporting this as a matter of ethics. And so that's one thing. We've, you know, I think increasingly we need to find local foundations and major donors who can support this work collectively, that we all get to collect together through PPAN to move every community in the state of Colorado to be the shining example and get them to see this coalition as being able to do that and understand this holistic approach. Every state has major donors. There's a lot of wealth, as you all know, in this country. They have an opportunity. Sometimes that's even a better route than foundations themselves. But I think between the two of these things, the corporate side and the individual, you know, philanthropy side, we have a real opportunity to make headway.
Okay.
And a shout out to Longmont, who may be on this call. They've already are biting the bullet and have started to implement a plan. It's, you know, it takes ongoing work to move things forward.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Jay. One thing that I would really encourage everyone to do is attend the Colorado Pollinator Summit where we bring together many of the organizations that are on the ground working for change. And that is on November 5th of this year. So, please plan on attending that. And one of the things we'll be doing is networking cities together with their communities, to create the types of change that everyone's interested in doing. So thank you, Jay, and on behalf of People and Pollinators Action Network, thank you all for attending the webinar, and hope to see you next time.